All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lessons Learned. This is part of the Pacific Northwest Forest Collaborative's annual workshop. We are excited today to have you join us. This is the, I want to say, fifth or sixth workshop in the series. Similar to last year, for those of you who participated, we're taking a virtual approach to this workshop. We'll have about 1 or 2 sessions throughout each month. We started in April, and then we are making our way through the end of October. If you had joined us for our last workshop, Environmental and Social Values and Restoration, that workshop was recorded and it has been posted to our webpage. So you're welcome to take, whenever you have a moment, take a minute to go and review that workshop. It was great. If you did participate, we would love your feedback on how it went. If you watch the recording and you want to provide some feedback on the content, that would be great as well, because that helps inform our workshop for next year and the sessions that we put on. Before we really dive into today's workshop, I have to take a moment and thank our sponsors, specifically our silver sponsors. That would be Hampton Lumber, Timberline Lodge, the Forest Service, and the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. I'm also going to take a quick second and go over some ground rules. And this is really just to keep us on track, eliminate distractions, and make sure that today's session keeps moving along smoothly. You will have an opportunity. We've tried to build in as many as we can for networking and conversation. If you could stay muted and keep your video off, unless otherwise instructed throughout the presentation, there may be opportunities to unmute or turn your video on later on, but for now that helps with bandwidth and to keep the distractions to a minimum. If there will be an opportunity to do some pretty informal networking at the very end of this workshop. So if you see someone on the participant list today who you really want to talk to and say hello to, at the end of today's workshop, I will open up breakout rooms. You'll be allowed to choose whichever one you'd like, and you guys can meet up and talk amongst yourselves as I call it, bumping into each other in the hallway after the workshop. So just know that opportunity will be available to you at the end of this, but for now, we're going to try and keep engagement to a minimum. The chat box will also be restricted to me, the host, after this. So as I'm going through this today, I'll keep it open for the next couple minutes. And if you could all introduce yourself, give your name, your organization, and where you're located, that would be great so we can see who's joining us today. With that, I'm going to pass it to Lloyd McGee of the Nature Conservancy. He'll be leading today's session. And Lloyd, the stage is yours.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sally. I'm going to hopefully get this up online. There we go. Okay, everybody see that all right? Does that work for you, Sally?
That works for me.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sally. I really want to thank Sustainable Northwest and put out some accolades, that you are doing a great thing, with the Pacific Northwest Collaborative Network and allowing us all to, share our stories and swap information. So I appreciate this opportunity for me to be able to share my survey that I participated in and helped manage. And I hope everybody can get something out of this. And I look forward to hearing chats and hearing people's feedback and questions at the end. So with that, I'll start. Again, I'm Lloyd McGee with the Nature Conservancy. I've been with Nature Conservancy in Wenatchee, Washington for 10 years and with Vaughan Brothers Lumber Company as a forester and log buyer, land buyer for 18 years, with the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition as the president there for 10 years during that time. And I'm participating in all the collaboratives in Eastern Washington, some leadership and some just on steering committees. And so with that, I just, am emphasizing collaboration as a way of life with my career. And so we, as the three collaboratives in Eastern Washington, kind of put our heads together, and we were talking about these three pilot projects that we have. And we decided that it would be a good idea to not only do lessons learned review, but actually do a survey that compares the three pilot projects and looks at, you know, similar questions to learn about successes and challenges and barriers, and really, you know, see what we can learn by comparing the three, as opposed to just doing individual lessons learned on each pilot project. So the Nature Conservancy, we volunteered to pay for and manage a contract and you know, provide the survey and the results. And we reached out, and through a bidding process, we selected Washington State University and Dana Moore as an independent evaluator through their research department. And she put together, with some help from her technical team, a really good survey, a really in-depth survey that ended up being a web survey. And the reason why is because the pandemic had begun. Everybody was locked down and we're going to have to do it from home. People are trying to figure out how to work from home, and here comes a survey. And so we were able to pull it off without meeting with people, and so we still have a lot of good data to work with. So I'm going to tell the story here of how this all came about, what we've learned in kind of an hourglass fashion. I'm going to start off kind of broad, you know, with the history of the survey, and then I'm going to get specific and, you know, shrink it into you know, lessons learned at specific levels, and then at the end I'll broaden it back out, and, you know, what the future use of lessons learned and some updates. So what is a pilot project survey? It's a web-based survey interviewing 65 respondents involved in the planning and implementation in one of three Eastern Washington pilot projects. I think the key to this is that we weren't going for huge numbers, but we were going for key personnel that could really answer some of the really in-depth questions. What is the purpose of the survey? It's really to not only capture lessons learned, but to compare pilot projects for not only what they have in common, but what are their differences, and you know, what would we recommend moving forward and what would we not. So that gets into how will this survey advance the work of forest restoration, and if we can capture the lessons learned, and if we can really hone in on where the efficiencies were captured and so forth, we will be able to improve on the next round of projects and hopefully increase pace and scale of restoration. So who are the participants? We really had two key groups. They were the key personnel that was with the Forest Service and then contracted NEPA teams, consultants, and then the other group was the key stakeholders from the collaboratives, and as they made their recommendations. So with that mix, we reached out to 93 potential participants, and we got 71% response rate, and we thought that was pretty good considering we were, you know, going into this pandemic and the lockdown. So as you can see, these three pilot projects are A to Z Mill Creek, Manastash, Tainum, and Upper Wenatchee. And the A to Z had 29 respondents, Manastash Tainum had 35, and Upper Wenatchee had 28 respondents. These three collaboratives are located physically, you know, in Eastern Washington, east of the Cascades, and just east of the Cascades is the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, and up in the northeast Washington is Colville National Forest. And these three collaboratives each have one pilot project that we were focusing on. How we collected the data and how we put them into survey questions, we broke them into quantitative and qualitative. And the quantitative really were coded responses to categorical questions, and the coded responses were so that everybody was anonymous. Everybody's response is just, you know, coded so that we don't really know who said what, but we could trace it back if necessary. But anyway, we wanted people to be comfortable, you know, being frank and candid, and people were definitely frank and candid. And then we also ranked in order of frequency the quantitative questions so that we were able to establish, levels and percent of success and percent of challenges and barriers. And then the qualitative, we had open-ended questions, which was more like an essay type of, some people wrote theses almost on it, and we captured it in their own words, and that was valuable. And then we went back and qualitatively looked for the themes, and I'm going to share some of those themes right now. But here is an interesting observation immediately out of the gate when we looked at all the data. The timing of the survey has a lot to do with how respondents will respond. That is what it is showing here. We have the A to Z project was already 100% through the NEPA process and 50% into the implementation when the survey questions were asked. Tatum was only 80% through the NEPA process, and Upper Wenatchee was only through by 60%. And we see that Upper Wenatchee pilot, being the earliest one, seems to have a lot of pessimism, or people's reactions were speculative at best, and had their doubts because early in a process, you're just not sure you're going to get what you think you want. And then, looking at the A to Z, a lot of people were already through the process. They see it being implemented. The confidence level is up. And so that is a factor that we notice. When is the best time to do a lessons learned? It seems like it's a good time to do a lessons learned discussion early in a process so that you can adaptively do course changes so that you can improve that project. But then again, if you wait until the end of a project or close to the end, you have better data, you have more certainty, and maybe a little bit more optimism and positive responses. And here's a quote from one of our stakeholders that kind of captures that feeling. A to Z is a big success in all 6 of the subjects: great NEPA planning, implementation, and terrestrial and aquatic work. The verdict is still out on the Upper Wenatchee pilot project and Tatum. So that's how it goes. You just, the verdict's out until you can see more. There is different concepts that were tested. So these are, differences in these 3 projects. The A to Z Mill Creek project was testing the concept of a winning bidder to use private funding to pay for and implement a restoration project from beginning to the end. So in this case, Vaughan Brothers Lumber Company was the winning bidder, and they paid for the NEPA contracting and all the implementation. And that is a test that's been proven out, and there's a lot of conclusions that we can share on that. Manastash Tatum project was testing the concept of multiple landowners coordinating work cross boundaries. It really is a 90,000 acre planning area in which 28,000 acres is Forest Service ownership. And there's DNR, Department of Natural Resources, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Nature Conservancy land, and some ceded Yakima Nation land. And so it's definitely a shared stewardship, and we're testing the cross-boundary shared resources concept. It was also a contracted NEPA. And Upper Wenatchee pilot project is testing the concept of taking a 30,000 acre project and adding 2 more watersheds and making it a 75,000 acre watershed, and testing the concept of using contracted NEPA to take on a big EA all under one decision. And the challenge on that one was that that we wanted to go to 75,000 acres, but the district did not feel that their NEPA team could take on such a big EA. So that's why we were tracking the contracted NEPA and seeing, if that could add additionality or add, more capacity. And the Upper Wenatchee pilot is really part of a larger Chelan pilot that is shared stewardship. And that includes fuels treatment on Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife land, Chelan County land, and it brought funding for TREC's prescribed fire training and formation of the Lake Wenatchee Fire Adaptive Community. A to Z Mill Creek project, as you look in the gray area in this map, It is just east of Colville and east of the Columbia River, which is Lake Roosevelt Reservoir. The Menasha-Tatum project in gray is just south of the Interstate 90 and south of Clay Elum and west of Ellensburg. And yeah, again, 90,000 acre planting area. And the Upper Wenatchee pilot project is just north of Leavenworth, which is, also northwest of Wenatchee, and about 75,000 acres there. So what challenges or gaps are these pilot projects attempting to overcome? One gap that the Forest Service recognizes and shared stewardship recognizes is getting appropriate funding. And all three of these projects have different funding sources. So A to Z, as you know, brought private funding from industry. And the Upper Wenatchee pilot project brought supplemental hazardous fuels funds to pay for all the shared stewardship, including the 75,000 acre planning area for NEPA contracting. And then of course, Tatum, they brought funding from Joint Chiefs. And it's the first time that Joint Chiefs funds in the United States were used for NEPA contracting, for planning. Normally Joint Chiefs is used for implementation. And also we're trying to, expand capacity. We need more personnel, more expertise. So bringing in contracted NEPA teams, bringing in expertise from consultants, ultimately, hopefully will lead to efficiencies. And comparing the NEPA approach for each project, the A to Z Mill Creek contracted NEPA team completed 2 EAs covering 54,000 acres total. And the first EA was completed in 18 months. The second EA was completed in 12 months. And that allowed for the first EA to be involved in implementation while the second EA was taking place under analysis. And Tatum was a contracted NEPA team that completed the EA on a little less than 28,000 acres in approximately 2 years, but we have not reached a decision on that NEPA yet. And we're hoping to in the next month or two. And same with Upper Wenatchee pilot project. We have an EA that's draft EA out, and we're hoping to get the NEPA decision in the next month or two. But anyway, Upper Wenatchee had a second contracted NEPA team that had to replace the first contracted NEPA team during the analysis process, mainly because, weren't able to meet the timeline and was struggling. And so there was a changeover to a second contracted NEPA team. And I'm going to show here some successes so you can get a feel for how the respondents felt about each of the 3 projects. And if you just focus on the green on each of these columns, shows the level of success for each of these topics to the left. And as you can see, A to Z had a lot of green, had a lot of successes. The Tatum project has quite a bit of success rate there. And Upper Wenatchee has a real mixed response for successes on all these categories. And I'll just give you a few examples. The proactive fuels reduction was 100% successful, according to the respondents on A to Z, 79% on Tatum, but only 46% on Upper Wenatchee. But the strange thing about that is, there wasn't any implementation on Tatum and Upper Wenatchee. So how do you know if there's enough fuels reduction? That question was a little difficult to answer. So people were speculating. And I think, a lot of people had some questions or doubt as to whether they're going to get enough fuel reduction done to be successful, or will there be enough treatment done, within the planning areas. So I think if we were to do the survey again, we might see some different responses now that things have moved along a little further. And contract NEPA, again, A to Z is 100% successful, only 40% successful Upper Wenatchee. And a lot of that might have to do with the changing of the guards right at the for the NEPA team right at the time that the survey was being done. And the role of contractors as project manager is very significant. And if you look at both A to Z and TANEM, you're looking at, in the 90 some odd % successful, whereas Upper Wenatchee, the contractors as project manager was only 23% successful. So the leadership is something that we need to focus on for improving in the future. And the rest of these are interesting to look at, and you can read them as we go. But as you can see, Upper Wenatchee Pilot Project really struggled with success on these categories. I'd say that cross-boundary planning and cross-boundary implementation were a challenge for all 3 pilot projects, and there's something to be said for the reasons there, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a few minutes. But also training in NEPA and training to work with contract and NEPA teams and stewardship authorities. You might say that there's a lot of people concerned about not having adequate knowledge and understanding of how to work with contract and NEPA as we just jumped into working with these NEPA teams. And so training is really important, and the cost and time of upfront survey work is also a big issue, and collaboration with recreation interests has been a challenge, and I think that's looked upon as something to improve on in the future. So the highest and lowest for each of these projects are kind of interesting to compare. The A to Z had 100% success on contract and NEPA planning, terrestrial and aquatic restoration, and mixed planning team. That is unique to the A to Z project. And then developing trust to foster innovation. All 3 pilot projects felt that developing trust to foster innovation was a key success, and so that's good to see. And then communicating collaboratively between project partners is something that is also shared with the TANEM project, and the TANEM project also had good success with landscape mapping and modeling, which was unique to that project. And then Upper Wenatchee had really good success with using local knowledge and having diverse stakeholders provide input. Those are 2 good successes that's good to see through that collaborative process. Now the lowest, again, was shared by all 3 pilot projects. Cross-boundary implementation, all 3 struggled with the implementation part of cross-boundary resource sharing. And training NEPA is shared between A to Z and TANEM, and collaboration with recreation interests is definitely shared between Upper Wenatchee and A to Z, whereas the TANEM did use good collaboration with recreation and some specific outreach styles. And TANEM having a U.S. Forest Service team supporting NEPA contractors for consistency, is something that's being pointed out, that they felt Forest Service could have been more supportive with the NEPA contractors there. And then, of course, human ecology mapping on Upper Wenatchee. But I think the thing I want to kind of focus on is, why do all 3 share in lowest success rate on cross-boundary implementation? Here's one quote that we got that I think was seen frequently, and it is answering that question to a degree. It says that, cross-boundary implementation, it did increase agency to agency coordination on projects, but cross-boundary work was isolated to individual participants working adjacent to other participants, so potentially not truly cross-boundary. In other words, they weren't really sharing resources across boundaries, like, on Forest Service and DNR land, they shared, prescribed burning with the same resources, and maybe, one boundary is on Forest Service, another boundary on DNR state land. I mean, we haven't broached that subject, within these pilot projects yet. So we'd love to hear how other people might be doing it in other forests, and have open discussions about that. Now, this graph here is just combining all three pilot projects, and the green is just showing the percent of difficulty or challenges and barriers. And if you look at the top, contracted NEPA by far was the most difficult and challenging. And that's what all three pilot project respondents agreed on. But what's interesting about that is the A to Z project, they felt that it was very challenging and difficult, and yet it was 100% successful. So the lesson there is, if something's really difficult, that doesn't mean you can't be 100% successful. So let's never just give up on something because it looks challenging or difficult. And then as you go down the list briefly here, the role of contractors as project manager is the second biggest challenge. And training in NEPA and training in working with contracting NEPA teams and stewardship authorities and even good neighbor authority, et cetera. You know, I mean, talking about all these new tools we have, that is somewhat of a barrier if we don't have enough training for our collaborative partners and our Forest Service specialists, you know, to really, you know, get the most out of, you know, the tools that we have. Mixed planning team, it was a challenge, cross-boundary implementation again, and then communicating collaboratively between project partners. I think even though it's challenging, I think all three pilot projects have shown that they've done a good job of doing that. And then having U.S. Forest Service team supporting the NEPA contractor for consistency is very difficult, and yet and can be a barrier. And yet we have seen degrees of success there. I'll move on. And if you look at this this chart here and you focus on the red numbers, those are the percent successes for each of these categories for each of the projects. And so again, planning terrestrial restoration, planning aquatic restoration, the A to Z was 100% successful. And you can see some contrast between the other two projects and their responses. We've already talked about proactive fuels reduction, but here's an interesting one. Having most interest at the table to reduce litigation. It's interesting because the A to Z Mill Creek project actually was litigated. And although it was litigated, and the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition stepped up and entered an intervener status, they were able to overturn the litigation, and the Forest Service was supported, and the project has moved forward. And so that is good news, and that the A to Z and Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition felt like they did have enough interest at the table to overturn litigation. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the Upper Wenatchee pilot project, they had only 58% success in bringing what they thought is, you know, good diverse interests at the table, and yet their collaborative, the North Central Washington Forest Health Collaborative, is one of the most diverse collaboratives. They have 24 member organizations and very diverse, and yet there's some pessimism as to whether or not they have enough interests at the table to help reduce litigation. So, you know, there's something to be said about you know, people's perspectives on that as well, and how they respond. And then again, we'll skip the training in NEPA. We've already captured, you know, the stark contrast in those three pilot project responses. And again, role of contractors as project manager at the bottom, you know, major contrast between Upper Wenatchee and the other two projects. I think this is pretty straightforward as far as a percent success. When you're just looking at these four NEPA categories, you know, there's room for improvement on Menashash, Tatum, and Upper Wenatchee pilot project. And again, it may have something to do with, you know, when the survey was and the questions were being asked. But you know, mixed planning team, is always a challenge, as we've said before. And so getting away from numbers now, we'll talk about, the actual quotes that we saw. And some of these quotes, with the frequencies that we saw them, kind of help tell the picture or paint the picture of, what we're facing. On the A to Z key personnel quote, we have third-party NEPA and project has allowed the forest to increase its pace and scale. This has allowed district planning staff to focus on other planning areas. That's one of the reasons why they are saying that, NEPA contracting was successful. It was additive. Now you turn in contrast to the Monash-Tatum key personnel quote, and this captures the concerns that they had for the level of success for using contracted NEPA. It says, the intent of this project was to have minimal U.S. Forest Service specialist involvement as we were all working on other projects. However, in the end, this has required an immense amount of work on the backside and has resulted in not as robust of a project. So you put that together with a couple of these quotes from the Upper Wenatchee project Stakeholder, and it kind of paints a more candid and frank picture of the concerns. This quote says, much of the challenge came from the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest District not wanting to give up the steering wheel. And another quote is, instead of U.S. Forest Service using NEPA contracting team to allow it to do other additive work, it shifted all of its work to focus almost exclusively on the pilot planning, undermining the very purpose of the pilot to accelerate restoration planning. Well, we can't talk about these three projects and these two national forests without talking about the broad differences in the complexities between, we'll say, between the two national forests. The Colville National Forest and the Mill Creek A to Z project is not a Northwest Forest Plan landscape. And the Monash-Tatum and Upper Wenatchee projects are on the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, part of the Northwest Forest Planning landscapes, with extensive salmon fisheries habitat and spotted owl and late successional reserve, so Endangered Species Act. So those complexities, basically tell us that the scale and complexity of the NEPA planning areas in these three pilot projects are factors that affect efficiency and success in developing EAs. So one longer quote here from a Monash-Tatum key personnel, I think kind of captures a recommendation that's being made here, and we'd have to really think about this as we move forward. The quote says, the NEPA process under the Northwest Forest Plan, especially in a landscape, an LSR, late successional reserve, and with multiple listed fish species, is extremely complex. And the NEPA contracting team included members of former Forest Service employees with vast knowledge of the Forest Service planning process, the Northwest Forest Plan, and species biology. Most contractors would not have access to this kind of expertise. I think the Forest Service should be extremely thoughtful in the kinds of projects that contract teams are asked to take on. The most complex areas might be best done with internal teams that are well-schooled in NEPA and the Northwest Forest Plan and work well with others. So that being said, another question we can ask is, would NEPA planning on large and complex landscapes that are beyond a certain threshold, beyond a certain scale, possibly be more efficient if divided into two or more NEPA decisions? I'm looking at a quote here from the A to Z Stakeholder, and that quote is pretty simple. It just says, dividing planning areas into two EAs to get the implementation faster worked. So that's part of the reason for their high level of success in their respondents is, the two EAs worked and got implementation on the ground sooner. So I'm going to go to conclusions now, and I'll just go through these, and we can talk about them in the chat later. But project managers have a strong influence on success. I think we all would recognize that. The Forest Service needs to identify key touch points for oversight of contractors rather than duplicating their work. As far as the Forest Service district ID team, maybe shadowing the contracted NEPA team, maybe some sort of format for touch points in which communication will happen only at certain times during the timeline, allowing the contracted NEPA teams to work on their own at times, and allowing the Forest Service personnel to do other work on other projects is going to help build efficiencies and be able to look at creating additionality. The NEPA contract documents need specific terms, but also flexibility to modify contract terms when needed. This is kind of a challenge in that we have the Forest Service at times realizing that in the contract, the terms they put in there did not specify for contracted NEPA team to do a certain task. And the Forest Service realizes, whoops, we missed that. Now we have to do it ourselves. How do you make sure you capture all the specific terms, and not leave anything out that the Forest Service now has to go back and do, but also leave enough flexibility, to allow the Forest Service to hand it off to the contractors and get it done. And then all 3 pilot projects found that the keys to success are using local knowledge, good Forest Service leadership, trust building, good communication, outreach, and maximum diversity. The opportunities for improvement, working with NEPA contractors, develop more efficiencies in communications between Forest Service staff and NEPA contractors, and make adjustments or changes quickly if contractors are not meeting goals. We found that out in Upper Wenatchee pilot. We had to go from one NEPA team and to go out and solicit for another NEPA team. And maybe if you're ready with plan B, not anticipating failure, but just in case somehow a NEPA team isn't working out or has to step out, that you have a plan B to bring in another NEPA team or a strike team, or turn it over to the district ID team, so that crucial time isn't lost. And then provide training, for working with NEPA contractors and stewardship authorities, and using the latest tools. We definitely heard that from the respondents. We need additional training, and then develop specific metrics to evaluate performance of NEPA contractors. And opportunities to improve working with project managers. What we heard is there needs to be more clearly defined role for the project manager, more clearly define who provides the project manager, and more clearly define what is the chain of command. There is times when things get a little muddled, and a clear line for the role of the project manager to give the project manager the best chance for success. And then improvement for project technical support. Further develop and standardize the aquatic restoration analysis and planning. When we're doing landscape evaluations, the terrestrial evaluations seem to go pretty smoothly, and are somewhat standardized, and are not that costly or that time consuming, whereas the aquatic restoration in landscape evaluation tends to be more onerous, more expensive, maybe more surveys, and not standardized means you're kind of recreating the wheel too many times. And how can we maybe standardize and provide a template to be able to keep up with the terrestrial landscape evaluation, and arrive at finished products at closer to the same time. And then analyze economics sooner in planning and utilize industry input. We need economic evaluations and assessments early and often along the timeline, so that we don't arrive at a surprise when we're ready to start putting projects out and realizing, well, these things won't pay for themselves. I mean, and I've heard industry often say that they're willing to help develop, an economic framework for evaluation. and then involve the consultation agencies sooner and at key junctures in the planning process. And then opportunities for stakeholder involvement. We can incorporate more transparency in the planning process to improve trust and project support, further develop opportunities for shared stewardship and shared resources. And how do we actually do shared resources implementation across boundaries? Expand local knowledge to include recreation interests and human ecology mapping. Increase engagement with communities for local knowledge using story maps and infographics and other technical support. And then improve tracking and volunteer time for achieving match goals. That one's kind of funny because using supplemental hazardous fuels funds on the Upper Wenatchee pilot project, we had to come up with a 20% match, which was somewhere around $400,000. And that became a real challenge because we had all this in-kind contribution from volunteers, through the collaborative and so forth. And if you put, let's say, $50 an hour on that, we need to be able to track how many hours have been accumulated in kind. And so we need to have a tracking system. We need to actually, have people maybe fill out forms and turn them in. And so we try to do that best we can, but, it's like herding cats, as you can imagine. So improving tracking of volunteer time for achieving match goals is what I'm getting at. So again, the big picture here, if we can come together and implement these lessons learned in the next round of pilot projects, then we can advance the pace and scale, for achieving forest resiliency, which was identified for us in Washington, at least, in the Forest Restoration Needs Assessment that Tom DeMayo from the Regional Forest Service and Ryan Haugo and others provided for us in 2014. We know that there's 2.7 million acres in Eastern Washington that need restoration. And through that restoration needs assessment, we applied it to the Department of Natural Resource 20-year strategic plan. And we are shooting for 1.25 million acres of implementation in Eastern Washington in the next 20 years. We're about 3 years into that now. And so to do 1.25 million acres of treatment, you probably need to analyze about 5 million acres of planting area. So we got a long ways to go. And so these pilot projects hopefully will take us, to a new level of efficiency and pace and scale. And with that, I'll wrap up that segment. And then I just want to add a few updates. And these updates, I think, are important to know in that, the A to Z Mill Creek project, as successful as it was, has been upgraded, I might say, to what we're calling the Chewelah A to Z. We call it 2.0. And that Chewelah A to Z has incorporated some things that were missing from the original A to Z Mill Creek project. Chewelah A to Z has incorporated the recreation component and really brought together a good group of folks that not only for recreation, motorized, non-motorized, but as well as all the other support for recreation that's out there, which we call tourism. And the mayor of Chewelah helped bring that group together. It was called the CARPE. It's called the Chewelah Area Recreation Planning Effort. And that's just one example of how lessons learned has brought a higher degree of outreach and effectiveness in arriving at agreed upon treatments in the forest that everyone cares about. And another interesting one on the Colville National Forest is called the Trail Project. And that is a Tribal Forest Protection Act project in which the Kalispels are working the Kalispel tribe are working closely with the Forest Service, Colville National Forest, and the DNR, and have a joint project manager. So it's a project manager work group, and they oversee that project, and it is shared stewardship. It's Forest Service, DNR land, and they are analyzing and looking at private lands and industry lands, but not making recommendations on them, but just incorporate them as part of the evaluation. And that's on 90,000 acres. So that's the Colville National Forest. The Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest is looking at possibly implementing an A to Z concept on a project called Chumstick to Lower Peshastin, which is about a little more than 100,000 acre planting area, which maybe only 50 to 60% of that land base is Forest Service land. It could be shared stewardship, but as an A to Z approach, let's see if it's possible to do it on a more complex forest, and see if industry is willing to step up and pay for and bring extra funding. Because the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, we always talk about we need to increase capacity, both funding and personnel. There's so much to do, and we're just trying to increase pace and scale. So these lessons learned are so valuable. And so I'm going to wrap it up now and turn it over to Sally. And Sally, you can take questions as you do, within chat, and I'll be glad to try to answer questions. And I really appreciate this time. And I really hope everybody sees the value in making comparisons and lessons learned. And I sure would love to hear about more lessons learned from all the other projects that are out there in the Oregon, collaborative network and others, including Western Washington. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Sally.
Thanks, Lloyd. All right, so we don't have that big of a group. I'm gonna open it up and allow, if people want to turn on their cameras, we can kind of have a group discussion and talk openly. I think that might work with this group. It's always nice when we can see people in person. So there have been a couple questions in the chat, and I'll just throw them out to start, and then I'll open it up to you guys for conversation after that. But there are a couple of clarifying questions, and we'll start with those. Lloyd, can you clarify when you had on the slide about stakeholder involvement, it was mentioned human ecology mapping. Can you explain what that concept is?
Sure. Human ecology mapping is a survey process in which you reach out in multiple ways to user groups to answer key questions about what their interests are and what their uses have been, on not only on big planning areas, but specifically what roads matter to them, what type of recreation matters to them, what policies matter to them, and gather all this data and bring it back, and it's beyond just a collaborative stakeholder approach. I mean, it's really getting to all the user groups and going out to these groups and providing these survey questions to bring back, as opposed to asking them to just come to us with their discussions. So it's a new approach to outreach, and that's the best way I can describe it. Somebody else might be able to describe it better that knows about it on this call, but it's kind of the latest outreach, and it's really valuable because it gets not only to hunters and recreationists, but just why do anybody come to the National Forest?
Thanks, Lloyd. The second question would be, can you reiterate what A to Z approach means?
Sure. Okay, this was an interesting challenge for the Forest Service, even at the policy and the legal level. It came out from the Colville National Forest, and the question was, can we get private industry to pay for planning and implementation on a project? And it had to go all the way to Washington, D.C., as you can imagine, and it had to go through legal counsel. And I think at the time, Congresswoman McMorris Rogers had to help, with some legislation. And the key to it is that the winning bidder will get the wood fiber and will be able to implement the whole project, but they must pay for the NEPA, and in this case, NEPA contracting, and oversee the NEPA contracting as far as, at least bringing in the invoices and paying for it. But there's a firewall in which the industry who is the winning bidder cannot have any say on what the treatment is on the ground, or any type of work that is planned through the process. All they can do is pay the invoices and then go out and implement it. So it's a risk. If you think you're going to get 50 million board feet out of this project and you only get 35 million, well, you didn't recoup, what you thought you were going to. If you got more than 50 million, you thought you were going to get 50, you came out better. And in this case, A to Z was a success financially, even though NEPA cost more than what was expected. Does that answer the question? If anybody needs further explanation, I'll be glad to.
Thanks, Lloyd. Oh, Sharon, were you going to jump in? Do you have a clarifying?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this is kosher to ask this, but I was curious as to how much it did cost for the NEPA.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This is kind of the challenge and kind of the legal issues here, is it's kind of proprietary information, for the winning bidder, and they don't like to really share the information because they're going to continue doing A to Z, and it becomes kind of a giving away their secret sauce or whatever. But in this particular case, it was in the millions. It wasn't like 500,000 or and it was north of 2 million, and it was but it was 2 EAs, and the wood supply that came off of that was significant enough, and the forest product sales were significant enough that it made it worthwhile. And Vaughan Brothers is willing to do it again, and that's why they're doing the Tooele A to Z. They were the winning bidder on that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. I have seen a couple questions come in, and I'm actually going to allow these people, I'm going to popcorn around to ask their questions themselves, because I don't want to put words in their mouth, and I think it's nice to hear the questions come out of people. So Angelina, you're up first.
Okay, yeah, so knowing that, contract NEPA is the most complex part of these pilot projects, and that even though it was difficult or complex, respondents found them to be successful on NUFIC. I was wondering if we can, or have we, as collaboratives, kind of come together and recommend that the Okanagan Wenatchee meet with the Colville to talk about contracted NEPA process and how to make that more successful on the Okanagan Wenatchee.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's right on. That's right on. That's what I think we're talking about today, is how do we share these lessons learned across these, jurisdictional boundaries or whatever, one national forest to another, one collaborative to another, Oregon State, Washington State. We've got so much in common, so much to share. Specifically, Angelina, the answer to that question is that Rodney Smolden, the forest supervisor for the Colville National Forest, has invited leadership within the Okanagan Wenatchee National Forest to come together and have those discussions, just internal to the Forest Service, and Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition and the North Central Washington Forest Health Collaborative, are looking at opportunities to get together and talk about this more. And that's part of what this survey is about. We did have a meeting in which all three pilot projects came together and had discussions and talked about their successes. And that was before the pandemic. And so nowadays it's a little more challenging, but yeah, I think that we have interesting scenarios here in which the A to Z, particularly, and contracting NEPA, is a situation where the Okanagan Wenatchee National Forest has not found a way to make it additional and step back and allow the contracting NEPA team to do it. And if the Colville National Forest has a way of building in, those touch points like we were talking about, stuff like that, I'm hoping that, the collaborative can encourage the two forests to work together. And I don't know if anybody knows this on this. Well, probably some of you on the call definitely know, but one of our Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest districts has now been moved to the Colville National Forest. And so now the Colville National Forest has picked up another 500,000 acres, and the Okanagan-Wenatchee has whittled off 500,000 acres. So these two collaboratives are going to have to interact together on that, that district. And so I think there's opportunities for more internal and joint collaborative discussions. Do you have anything to add to that, Angelina? Any ideas?
I think it might be beneficial, maybe even in the Washington Collaborative Network, for us to kind of develop some sort of letter recommendation to have them go over certain points where those projects really struggled. And I think it's more than just the leadership teams, but the IDT staff that are the ones that were interacting with the resource specialists from the contracted NEPA team, that maybe needs some of that as well. I think it's more than just Forest Service leadership. So I'll bring that up for a future call.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great. Trent, you're up next.
Great. And I just have one clarifying question before my long one that I sent to Sally. And Lloyd, thank you for that presentation. Can you remind us, I believe there were outside objections that turned to litigations that were not part of the collaborative, right? I think it was Alliance for the Northern Rockies that objected to the A to Z project. And outside of the actual content or process of the NEPA that was objected and litigated, I believe they specifically named third-party NEPA, who were also the winners of the timber or biomass, as one of their reasons for litigating. Is that right, Lloyd? Can you refresh our memory on that?
As far as I understand, that was part of their litigation. It was the whole challenge to whether the A to Z approach is appropriate. And, that's why I really wanted to emphasize how important it is that there is a firewall between, the winning bidder and the planning team. The planning team, plans all the treatments and prescriptions, and the winning bidder, if they were able to influence that, I could see where litigation, would be appropriate, and it would be wrong for industry to be able to pick what they want treated and how much wood and all that stuff. But with the firewall that was created by the Colville National Forest within the contract, that litigation was overturned.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Lloyd. Maybe we could even send out the link. I think it's just important to disentangle the fact that they were litigating on the actual NEPA process versus the content and concern of what was in NEPA. Because I think there were some listed species concerns and other things. But anyway, thank you, Lloyd. I think that's just important to recognize that it's been challenged in court and been upheld as a legal option for the Forest Service to do this. And so in case there were concerns about taking it to other landscapes. And then my question, Lloyd, was that you talked about having 2 EAs done on a landscape so that it could speed up implementation. And I totally appreciate that, especially when there's components of an EA that can slow things down potentially for another year or two. But I'm also want to point out that inherently by splitting it into 2 EAs, it could also include more complications, because then species level analysis has to be done separately, consultation has to happen separately. And I'm just wondering if you considered, or if there were any reflections on having a single EA or a single NEPA analysis, and then having 2 decisions, one of which could be signed earlier, rather than 2 separate EAs. Or is there any conversation about the trade-offs between those 2?
Yeah, there's been significant conversation about that. One example is on the Upper Wenatchee pilot project. We were hoping to get the first project out the door off of that EA in 2021, which is now. And unfortunately, with the timing, it looks like the first project's going to come out in 2022. So we started asking the tough question: can we have 2 decisions? Can we just do a decision on the first, just the project that might be 1,300 acres, just treatment of 1,300 acres to get this implementation started on the ground, the community and the private landowners adjacent are going to be so glad to see it started earlier rather than later. There's multiple reasons to do it, but there were multiple reasons why it could be more complicated for the Forest Service and ultimately would delay longer. And so, that we had to just, as a collaborative, we had to kind of agree to let the Forest Service call that shot and, not push it any further. But, that's one example. But a bigger question is, what is the appropriate scale to get the most, NEPA, with a decision, efficiently and effectively? I mean, there's, collaborative partners in California and other places, Arizona, they're going to 500,000 acre, planning area. I mean, is that, how you're going to increase pace and scale, or would it be, to take, into chunks and, do separate NEPA, not only separate decisions, but separate NEPA? All of that, I think we're still, waiting for the jury to come in. That's why pilot projects are so valuable. Let's keep trying new things. And yet the Forest Service feels, I think sometimes, that trying new things is just, how do you ever land on something and stick with it, so, it's interesting how we're able to think outside the box and still try to, be successful.
Really great question. Is bigger always better?
Yeah, thanks, Trent.
Pete, you're up next.
Hi, Lloyd. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate hearing it.
Yeah,
Do you think that, or how do you think the surveys respondents would have changed their responses had the surveys all been done post-decision, right? Because like Upper Wenatchee and Tatum project were still in the planning process, right, when the survey was done. So do you think that impacted, or how do you think that potentially impacted responses, or did you get any qualitative information from the survey from that?
Yeah, I think we would get significantly more detail. And I think that we would probably see maybe, and I've heard this from respondents, that they wish that they could do the survey now because things have, been ironed out, so to speak, and on the Upper Wenatchee pilot project, and it's come together so much more nicely now. That the new NEPA, I call them the new NEPA team, but the second NEPA team, has done a great job, and they're bringing it to fruition right now. And the project management has improved, and I think we would get some positive success rates that we didn't get before. But again, when is the appropriate time to do a survey? And I just want to point out that each of these pilot projects are having their own lessons learned forums with their collaboratives separately from this survey. And so they're each focusing on their own project and their own lessons learned. This was kind of a pilot in doing a survey where we compare 3 projects together. And so right now, Upper Wenatchee pilot project, we're, within the next month or so, we're going to have another lessons learned deep dive, and we're going to talk about contracting NEPA and what can be done differently, and maybe even reach out to the Colville National Forest and find out what lessons that they've learned for contracting NEPA that is more additive. So I'm saying there is maybe even an attempt to go out and do another survey, an updated survey. There's nothing saying we have to land on this survey and that's it. So it's an adaptive management approach and an iterative process.
Yeah, it seems like once these projects are being implemented and sort of all further down in the actual implementation, it'd be interesting to hear how folks that participated in the planning view the project, during and, implementation as well. That'd be neat to see.
Yeah, good point.
Those were the questions from the chat. Lloyd, if you're okay with it, are there any other questions that are on people's minds right now, or thoughts on the presentation? Lloyd, do you have any questions for the group?
Ooh, that's a good one. Sure. Yeah, I mean, contracted NEPA is, you know, kind of the discussion, you know, that brought out the most difficulties and challenges. You know, here's just a basic question. Is that some experiences anybody has on this call or on this Zoom that, you know, is different from what we came up with?
Well, I'll speak to it from a previous BLM experience as
Okay.
working with the BLM as a NEPA planner for 8 years, where I saw contracted NEPA be the most successful. And this is kind of counterintuitive to the A to Z approach. However, the one thing I want to mention about the A to Z approach compared to the contracted NEPA on the OCA win is that you can hand select a contractor as a third party paying for NEPA, whereas in these other processes, it was a bid process. So you can't hand select your contractor. And when the Upper Wenatchee pilot project had a contractor that didn't meet the needs of the contract and had to be terminated, that had a huge effect. And that's the case on any project that you put out to bid like that. So that's one thing that A to Z, you know, is set kind of apart because it's a different approach in the way that you actually hire a contractor. So when we hired contractors with the BLM, what we saw most successful was keeping a kind of concise, smaller project area and not doing things that are sort of outside our normal wheelhouse. So for instance, on a landscape health evaluation, similar to what the forest and DNR does to look at these landscape levels, you might have that overall landscape health evaluation done and be able to pass that information off, but maybe not also do condition-based NEPA on top of then adding the doubled project size. So kind of pick one thing to try. So if it's a condition-based NEPA project, do something more site specific, a smaller project, and test out that theory of condition-based NEPA. If it's landscape level, you know, large scale project that you're going for, do that, but maybe on a simpler type of EA where you're not adding in a bunch of different types of activities and proposed actions. So simplifying so that it's something a contractor can take on, not being familiar with the area is something that we found most successful. And the touch points that you alluded to, Lloyd, it's a first meeting to talk about the project and develop a proposed action with the contract team. They go and they finalize the proposed action. The Forest Service then okays it. And then you talk about methodology and they agree to the indicators that will be used in analysis. That's another meeting. And then it's into reviewing the draft alternatives and having a round of edits. Then it's the draft EA and a round of edits. So it's really like 5 touch points and that's it. And at those stages, you're seeing how the project comes along and making sure that it meets the agency's needs. So those were really specific to make sure that we had, you know, resource management plans fail from a contract standpoint and we weren't able to terminate the contract. It's a really tough process when you get a contractor in there that doesn't meet the needs. You can't always terminate. And so you end up with a product that the Forest Service then has to come back and redo. And that's more work than them just starting it from the beginning. So finding a good contractor is the biggest deal. And that's going to be something that's hard to overcome in a bid process. But there's lots of ways to do that. We've talked about that a little bit in Washington.
Yeah, I have another statement question. And it's really about that trails project on the Colville National Forest, which is a TFPA. And what's interesting about that project, as well as other aspects of it, is that the NEPA team is actually a mixed NEPA team in which there's significant Kalispel tribe representation on the NEPA team and a few DNR folks and Forest Service folks. I think there's like 34 participants in the NEPA team, and Gloria Flora, you know, from the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, has been project manager, and you know, it's a different approach. I think there's even some strike team participants from the Forest Service rather than just from the Colville National Forest participants. And so it's another experiment, and it's going to be interesting to see what we learn from, not just working with a contracted NEPA team that's already been together, but pulling a team together, that wasn't together before. And Gloria, if you had put you on the spot, if you have anything to add to that, but I just thought that was really interesting for us to bring out.
Oops, sorry. You described that well, Lloyd. It was very interesting, and it was different than a contract team in some ways, but in other ways, for instance, the Kalispel tribe participants had their own methodologies of how they went about addressing NEPA, and they had to unlearn those and relearn the Forest Service methodology. There was some cross-pollination and some lessons learned that was helpful. But the project was additionally complex because we were trying to apply EADM, the environmental analyses decision-making process, the newer criteria, quote, streamlining NEPA, which moved it into more of a conditional mode. And we were one of the first projects on the forest under the new forest plan. So we had a lot of balls in the air on that one. But the key, again, is communication and relationships. We had some pretty big bumps that we had to work through and get over. But in the end, I think we have a very good product. And we also have the benefit of the Kalispel tribe. A lot of their Natural Resource Department professionals who were involved in the EA now understand the Forest Service process and are more likely and able and willing to step in when the Forest Service has a need. And you're right, we did use an enterprise team, an engineering enterprise team, because the engineering team was diminished already on the Colville, and then so didn't have the personnel available to do what was necessary in the time required. And we borrowed a landscape architect from the Okanagan Wenatchee, hired a retired Forest Service individual to be the writer-editor, and then contracted with me through the Kalispel tribe, because it was easier than contracting through Forest Service, to also be the project ID team leader. So it was quite complex, but in the end, successful.
Wow. That is so, that's so telling. And again, the options are, there's just multiple options out there. And that's why we really need to capture what works best. And, and what we are seeing is that we can't just wait until one project is completed and implemented and all sealed, signed, sealed, and delivered before we move on to the next project. I mean, these projects are overlapping each other, and we're learning stuff so quickly that we have got to share this information and pass it on, so that we can minimize going down the wrong roads, or, doing something that's less efficient than what we're hoping for. And so, that's why it's so interesting to talk about the A to Z Mill Creek project, but then you've got these other projects that are already off the ground, and the Trails project already has the NEPA decision, and they're moving into implementation. So, what I think
Lloyd, if I might,
18 months, right? Go ahead, Gloria.
Yeah, if I might interject, just something that we learned. And I just caution everyone entering into these multi-agency or contracted NEPA kind of situations is, as the ID team leader, I was keeping a fairly complex contact list together. And what became so evident throughout the project is that the Forest Service in particular has a lot of personnel changes, people going on details, people coming in, people moved into training positions, retirements. And in 18 months, we had 18 personnel changes on the ID team, and 14 of those were from the Forest Service. So the mercurial nature of Forest Service employment and details, promotions, etc., can really challenge a project. We even had the decision maker, the district ranger, retire partway through the project, a good halfway or more, and a new district ranger from back east come in and join the party. So I would advise folks to have a very clear vision, very clear understanding of the processes, so that you can onboard new individuals very quickly. Because that became self-evident that unless we had a way to clearly and consistently bring people up to speed when they appeared and then disappeared, from the project, that was a really important element.
Yeah, great point. Thank you.
Are there other thoughts or questions about any of this? This has been really fascinating. Thank you, Lloyd, for presenting and bringing this topic to the workshop.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
I'll just add, Lloyd, I wonder if there isn't an opportunity, and maybe the Colville has this with their new forest plan. I see Nicholas here. I don't know who else from the Forest Service might be able to answer this, or the stakeholders, but for those who don't have a new forest plan, since you're the only one in the region since 1989 to have one, I feel like the rest of us are still working with those obligations at the forest plan level. But what we've learned from the CFLRP landscapes is sometimes that can be done, a project level requirement can be answered at the forest level for all project levels. So in other words, management indicator species is a good example that can become add a lot of analysis at the project level, which is why people might want 2 EAs or 2 decision notices. But if you analyze for MIS at the forest level, then you don't have to analyze at the project level. It's just that forests aren't doing that. So I wonder if we want to talk about efficiencies and freeing up NEPA to be sped up, if we couldn't, that was just one example. I don't mean this just to be about wildlife, but if we couldn't consider some forest level analysis by some hotshot analysis teams that would then free projects up to not have to do that level of analysis. And if that alone couldn't speed up efficiencies. Yeah, Nicola, you're on.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Nicola Smith. I work for the Forest Service Regional Office. I'm the Regional Partnership Coordinator, so I don't work in planning. So I unfortunately can't get into the weeds. But I would say, Trent, to your point, I definitely observe a trend, especially following the aquatic restoration environmental assessment that was completed. I've already been contacted by our regional botanist and regional wildlife ecologist about an interest. It's really exploratory, but an interest in doing that for, projects that have more of a terrestrial management emphasis. And that would, of course, include, MIS species and threatened and endangered species, including plants. So super early stages, but I share that just in the spirit of a recognition of the need for greater efficiency. And I've learned a lot in this conversation, because as a partnership program manager, a question that I'm often asked by partners is, what NEPA is complete on a given forest or district, and how can we support either envision, a vision for that project or implementation. And I see Tessa here from Blue Forest Conservation. So it's an example of one of our wonderful partners who is, seeking that. That's one of their first questions. And when I speak with colleagues about either enterprise teams or contract NEPA, I hear some really mixed reviews. And I've learned a lot on this call about strategies. One question I had for you, Lloyd, but I think Gloria and Angelina and others answered it, is how to balance the importance of that local expertise and understanding of the ground with an approach to contracting that can actually be successful and doesn't essentially duplicate an effort or involve a lot of Forest Service involvement. And you've all shared great strategies for doing that. So I've rambled, but yes, Trent, if there is capacity external to the agency that can help us with that higher level of efficiency while having enough of that local level expertise to actually streamline the process rather than duplicating, I think that would be great. It's a really good suggestion.
All right, well, with that, Lloyd, if it's okay, I'll share your contact information for those who have questions about the survey and the process.
Feel free to reach out to me, anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this conversation today, everyone. And so this workshop, as I mentioned at the start, is part of the annual Pacific Northwest Forest Collaboratives Workshop that Sustainable Northwest hosts every year. Our next workshop will be on July 6th at 1 p.m. and that's restoring ancient grasslands in the Upper Willamette. If you have questions or if you want to see what else is happening in the series, if you want to sign up to receive updates, please visit our webpage. If you have specific questions about this workshop, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the bottom of the screen there. And again, thank you everyone for coming today and participating. We've had a great conversation.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your afternoon.